Welcome to episode 3 of Community is a Verb. Our show talks about the tools for social action, social media, systems, processes, and strategies, and the world that we want to create and we want to see in the future. My name is Conner Cayson, your co-host here at Community is a Verb. And next to me, via the powers of the internet, is my spectacular co-host, Mr. Well-Traveled.
Wow, I'm spectacular today. I like that. I need you like wherever I am, like when I step into a meeting at work and the spectacular travel. That's what I need to hear because that'll give me hype. All right. So yes, thank you guys for joining us. This is the Social Action Podcast for allies, advocates, and activists.
Well, I'm glad to see you again. Thank you for being flexible. We're recording a little bit later than we initially intended. That was my fault, but it's always great to see you, Mr. Well-Traveled. And today's show is a first for us because we have our first ever guest on Community is a Verb. I'm excited to introduce Vanessa. She's the host of the Undefined Good Girls Podcast, along with her co-host, Kiara. The show is about shattering the label of good girl and empowering women to discover their authentic and undefined lives. Vanessa, hello and welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you guys so much for having me. So excited to be joining you today on this episode.
Well, we were inspired. I know we mentioned you in the last episode. Mr. Well-Traveled introduced your show to me, and we just loved so much about what you had to talk about. And so we thank you so much for being on the show. And I want to give you the platform to start off. Tell us a little bit about your show, and I would love to know how you came up with the show and what's it all about and what do you want to accomplish.
Sure. So, of course, you mentioned my sister and I have a podcast, the Undefined Good Girls Podcast. Actually, it kind of started as just my sister and I talking. Normally, when we get together, we spend hours chatting about life, chatting about our experiences, chatting about social issues. And we initially, I believe last year, sat together and we recorded kind of like a video recording of us just having a conversation. Nothing ever happened with that. We were kind of like, we had a great conversation, but of course, during the time of quarantine and us being together, we were both at my parents' house at that time. We were like, you know what, let's go ahead and actually do something together. My sister is a performer, so that's kind of what she does for a living. I also have like creative, talents and inclinations. So we were like, we want to create together. Let's do something. We haven't created together in a long time. So we were like, what if we do a podcast? And I was like, that's great. We can do that. I'm like, there's so many podcasts, I don't know if our voice will, make a difference, but I feel like we have something to say. So we kind of came up with the idea of the Undefined Good Girls because with both of us, we were raised in a very formal, strict type of conservative upbringing. But as we've kind of become adults and come into our own, we've discovered kind of breaking away from that label that a lot of people have placed on us and that we see a lot of women have placed on them throughout their lives. So that's kind of the idea of the title and what we talk about, just different topics. It is a podcast geared towards women, but we get so much support from men, which is awesome. So we're like, hey, if you want to listen to it and you find something beneficial, that's great. But we kind of just wanted to put our voices out there. We've got some great feedback, and that's kind of how it started.
I really enjoy the show. And I know you mentioned that it was for women, but having a different perspective is so important, especially now. I mean, always should have been at least. Yeah. And so hearing those things and hearing that different perspective, I think is very important. And so even if you are a man listening to this, I highly recommend that you also tune into the show because, and you point this out in your most recent episode, it's very easy for a man not to understand the perspective and the things that women go through. And so it is very important to hear specifically from a woman about the things that they're going through. And we're going to talk later about the things that deal with their emotions or their body or their lives, and the things that they go through are more important than ever to know. And so I think there's a lot of insightful perspective to take from the show.
Thanks.
So actually, that's good. I'm glad you said that because that's where I was going to jump in and say, I wonder from your perspective, Vanessa, what do you think is appealing about your show to men? Because I think initially when I started to see you promoted on Instagram, I thought, well, this must be a show that's for women. And, that's a very simplistic way of thinking about anything, right? It's called Undefined Good Girls Podcast. Must not be for me.
Right.
And it's like when I heard someone recently say something about, they read an article about black banking and they were like, oh, well, I'm white, so therefore I can't go there. And I'm like, well, actually it's a bank, so anyone can go and put their money in a bank. So I listened to the podcast and I was like, wow, I really like this dynamic. So two sisters talking and then the perspectives. And I think for me, that's what I find appealing. I don't think about it as, whether it's for me or not, or whether it's about women or for women. I think about, I want to hear what the two people having the conversation really have to say about this particular topic. So I know in the last episode, you and your sister talked about Cuties, and I didn't really have any interest in the movie at all, but I actually really enjoyed hearing your different perspectives on it and sort of the journey that your thinking went on in as you reacted to not only what you heard others say, but also then your own thought process as you were reacting to the clips you saw. And so I'm just curious, do you find that other men have the same perspective as Conner and I, or is it, I don't know, what's it like?
Yeah, I think one thing, and that's something I think as well, once we get further into conversation, is that there are a lot of similarities or intersectionalities that men and women can come together on. And I think sometimes when we talk about, like we had a guy reach out to us and say the topic on perfectionism, like really touched him because he has been a perfectionist in his life. And so even though we were talking about it from a woman's perspective in our own lives, a man can talk about being a perfectionist or dealing with breaking from that, being a people pleaser. A man can have body issues and maybe have body issues in the way where you come up in two different families and navigating through that. So I think part of it is men finding the commonalities with what we're talking about. And I think some of them just enjoy that we're very candid about it. One thing that's very important to us is that we're like, okay, we don't want to sound like we're bashing men in any way. Like we're trying to be careful, like even if we're calling men to be accountable, that we're not coming across as like hateful. And so I think that is a way that men are still able to hear it and maybe hear some tough things we're talking about, but understanding that we want us all to win. We want women to win, same as RBG, that ideology of like, when women win, men can win and we can go forward. So I think that is why men have listened, but it was a shock to me. I was not expecting to have men like reach out to us and say, great job, we enjoy what you're doing. So.
Yeah, I think it's always important to have that perspective and learn different things and speak to different people. And you brought up the learning how to critique or criticize or evaluate and give commentary on lots of different aspects of life, especially aspects that are highly opinionated and can get really intense. And we're all learning how to deal with using our language in the right way so we can be constructive, but not attack so much, right? And because that really is how we are going to grow as individuals, as a community, as a society, is we've got to be able to listen to the feedback that we're getting. And the show is all about action, so taking action against that critical feedback that you get.
Right.
All right, so we've got two short segments that we like to start the show off with before we get into our major topics. The first one is our shout outs section of the show. And so Mr. Will Travis, I'll let you start off. What's your shout out for someone in the community this week?
Actually have three, and they'll be quick. I came across a great new podcast and IG account called Ballot Defenders, and I really enjoyed it. They followed me, and so I was like, oh, well, that's great. They're so nice. They followed me. But also, they had a great conversation in their first episode about RBG, and that helped me to get some additional perspective that I didn't have before. So I want to shout them out. Also, Kallie Music, a great account that has a new single. So Kallie is the artist, and she has a new single called Unicorn, and I enjoyed it, and I've been listening to it, and it's kind of in my head because it's one of those kind of like pop songs that like it's very like light and uplifting, and then it you don't forget it. And so I've been listening to Unicorn all week. And of course, I also want to shout out Tyree, who's sitting right here, because Tyree has been really helpful. I don't know if everyone knows this, but I'll be taking a road trip soon. And that road trip is I'm going to Texas, and I'm going to be spending some time there. And I'll be recording the next couple of episodes there. And when I am there, I need to have a certain level of equipment to be able to ensure the same level of sound quality. So Tyree did a great job in telling me what I need to get. And right after this, you'll see this on the Instagram story that we're going to go through the equipment and kind of, he's going to teach me how to set it up, because I don't know anything actually about audio engineering, and that's his specialty. So I'm excited about that. And yeah, those are my 3 shout outs.
Vanessa, do you have anyone that you'd like to shout out this week?
Let's see. I would like to shout out one of my friends. Her name is Taisha on Instagram. She's Ty Talks. She actually has a single coming out. So when you're kind of mentioning singles, October the 10th, but I've just been hearing little snippets of it and I love it. She is a beautiful spirit. She is all about empowerment and mindfulness and releasing negativity and inviting positivity and manifestation into your life. So her song is about letting it go, releasing, and, you know, welcoming better. And so I'd love to shout out her. We go way back. I've known her since middle school. So I'm really proud of her and seeing the woman that she's become. So shout out to you, Taisha.
Excellent. I'm looking forward to, I got to go listen to both those songs, obviously. I want to give a shout out to Amanda at Coca Amley. She did our podcast artwork that we just launched this week. And so she deserves a shout out for creating that. It was just super fun and nice of her to do that for us. And we feel that it just represented us in a very cool way. It was unique. It made us feel a little bit more official when we had like real podcast artwork and we didn't just have a Canva template with text on that. So that was great. Thank you very much, Amanda. So the next part of the show,
Conner, hold on. Before you move on, I just want to say, yes, shout out to Amanda, because let me tell you, the feedback I've gotten on the artwork, people have been like in my DMs like, oh my gosh, you look at you, you've got this show. I'm like, wait, the show, we're on episode 3 now. But it's the artwork. I'm telling you, the artwork changed the game.
I love the artwork. It's very, I like you said, it makes people feel like it's official, I guess, and it's something that's like more of a trademark. But I think it's awesome. I love how it turned out.
So, Vanessa, I was looking at your artwork, and yours is kind of similar with this like modern art style that like kind of, it's like a flat design with a minimal facial recognition. So, so how did you come up with your artwork, and how did that get created? Because it is kind of like a similar style.
Yeah. So we also use Canva. So that may be why it has a similar, you know, design features, but I was kind of looking at different minimalistic people, because I was like, I don't want to have myself like I'm on a LinkedIn profile picture as I just was like, I don't want to do that. I'm still getting comfortable with like putting my actual self out there. So for me, I guess it was kind of a comfort thing. Like, I don't want to put my face, but let's make up, you know, people that kind of represent us. So that's all I did. I was looking for someone that I felt, an image that kind of represented my sister and her style and look, and then one that might have represented mine. And I was like, okay, these 2 girls will work. Do you like them? We initially had like a design where the girls had like their fist up, and we were like, oh, we don't know if we want to do this. We were asking people for different feedback because, you know, while we will talk about different topics, we didn't want to start off with people thinking it was like a militant podcast or a radicalized podcast, even if we do discuss things like that going further. So we kind of came up with that where it was more relaxed, general. And then I had the idea of, because I don't know if you see on the design, there's halos above the girl's head and then has an X.
Yep.
So I was like, let's do that, because it's called the Undefined Good Girls. So we're like shattering that. So
I love that little detail. Yeah, the halo with the X really sticks out in our work.
Yeah.
All right, so for the next segment of the show, Vanessa, we actually took this from you. It was inspired by your show, because you and your sister always start off your show with just a check-in with each other, which I assume it was a very natural process, because that's what you do when you were talking to each other anyways, right?
Yes.
And so let's start with our check-ins. And the thing that I'll start off with was this week, Attorney General William Barr deemed Seattle, New York, and Portland as anarchist jurisdictions, right? Which to me just blew my mind, because when I saw that, I was like, last night I went out for a picnic at the park, right? Like my wife and I got food from a restaurant and we sat at the park and like had a nice little date with each other. And so when you say anarchist jurisdiction, you think we're like in a horror movie,
Right.
or, you know, like a war zone. And that's not what it is at all. And obviously that's based off events that happened 3 months ago in Capitol Hill at CHOP, right? And CHOP got dismantled over 2 months ago. And so it's just kind of like, what's going on? Like, yes, there are protests, and rightfully so, but to really put our city and our state at risk when it comes to funding by giving it that jurisdiction was something that I had to bring up on the show, because I think it's extremely inappropriate and unfair, and seems like a very strong political move. And it's like, it's not like that. And it's unfortunate. I get calls from, I have family in Idaho, in California, and in New York, and they're like, are you okay? Is something wrong? Like, what's going on? And same thing. My dad called me and I was like, we're at the park eating dinner right now, right? It's not this scary place. And so that was my big thing that happened this week that just kind of blew my mind. And it's very sad that happens. And I really am praying that doesn't have long-term consequences on the funding, because those dollars are extremely important. They go to very important programs that help the citizens of the state and the city. And I hope that it doesn't turn into something worse. So, you want to jump in, Israel Child? Sorry.
I'm just, just even like this listening to this, it's just, I don't even know what to say. Like, I remember when, I think, were you the first person to tell me about anarch? I think you did. I think you like texted me or something, like you're like, anarchist jurisdiction. I didn't even understand what that meant. So I had to Google it, because it wasn't clear to me what even that was in reference to. Yeah, I mean, Capitol Hill's my neighborhood, so I've been around, and I'm aware of the protests that have never really stopped, but anarchy is not what's happening out there. And I think as a political ploy, it is very misleading to go on international TV and use the power of the federal government to label a specific city and neighborhood as an anarchist jurisdiction, knowing that then it can be tied to funding for that city, but also that unless you are actually here on the ground, because there are people who live in the region who are not as clear about what happened at CHOP several months ago, because I've talked to my coworkers who live in the suburbs, and that's just one county away, and they hear the same news and have the same reaction as folks who are halfway across the country. So when I read the article, I think it was Washington Post or New York Times or one of those, and I thought to myself, okay, well, this is getting more serious, I think, because I think my initial reaction was, oh, okay, well, more of the same. But then when I saw the tie to funding, that's when I said, okay, this is really, really serious, because before it was just rhetoric. Now it's a clear action that I really don't know what we as individuals can do about it, because I think that was my real question was, okay, if funding is impacted, what do the people do? How do the people deal with this? And I still am not sure, because I don't think we have enough information right now about it. But I did listen to a really interesting episode of Seattle Now podcast, and they had some jokes about the anarchist jurisdiction. And I think sometimes that's the best thing you can do, right? Like to cope with a really unclear and potentially, stressful situation is to try to use a little humor to get through it. And so I think, that's where I am right now, is I'm trying to have a little humor about the situation, but my hope is that there are no further actions, that this is really just a political stunt, and that funding is not impacted.
Yeah, I saw shirts that already have them printed that people are selling to do fundraisers. So
already, wow,
well, yeah, once you take it into a shirt and the city kind of embraces that, yeah, it's nice to take it, to laugh it off or just hope that it doesn't turn into something worse.
Yeah.
And so Vanessa, how's your week been going? How are you doing?
It's been an interesting week. Obviously here in North Carolina, we haven't been given that designation, but just with everything that's kind of going on, I feel like every month is something new of just worldwide or countrywide shock or news that we're experiencing. So overall, it's been okay. I think I mentioned to you both that I'm going to be planning to move. So I've been doing a lot of getting stuff together, getting packed. And it's really interesting. I think for me, this year has been a mixture of the worst moments ever, but I'm still also having really great positive moments and seeing, different increases in my own personal life. So it's kind of interesting to live in that parallel. But overall, my week has been okay. I've been trying to just take some time for myself if I'm feeling overwhelmed by the news or things that's going on, but just moving forward.
Getting into a new house or new apartment, just having a new home and a new space.
Yes.
It kind of sounds like a scary time to be doing that, given the pandemic, but
yeah,
it's also probably so refreshing, to get more space, but really just to have something new, right? Something to be excited about, reorganize, reposition, wake up in the morning and be like, ooh, this feels fresh and unique. And that's probably really nice to have, given all the things that are happening in the world.
Yes, exactly. I'm excited to have a designated office space. Since I mentioned to you that I work from home full time now, even before the pandemic, I was doing that. So it's nice to be able to set that up. I'll have like a nice backyard that I can kind of go out and sit and just have peace and quiet. So excited about that.
Congratulations. I'm sure you'll be documenting a little bit on your Instagram account too. I'll make to link your Instagram here on the notes. If anyone's interested in following her there. So we also had National Voter Registration Day, which was this past Tuesday. I'm not sure if you have any comments, but I might have seen that voter registration got extended in a lot of places, but maybe I'm wrong and I'm speaking out of place. I'm not sure if any of you have information on that. But obviously that's different by state. So that was particularly here. And then lastly, a bunch of protests. New protests sparked this week in cities all around the country, or I guess continued. And that was because this past Wednesday, the Breonna Taylor case went to the grand jury and the news wasn't very good. Not what a lot of us wanted to see, specifically with I want to make sure that I get this right, but they indicted former officer Brett Hankinson on 3 counts of wanton endangerment for firing bullets that went into the apartment next to Breonna Taylor's on March 13th. And there was no indictment against Sergeant Jonathan Mattingly and Detective Miles Cosgrove, who actually fired the bullets who killed Breonna Taylor, which created a whole nother level. In Kentucky, we saw him here in Seattle and kind of all around the country. And so how are you guys feeling about the outcome and the protests that are going on around the city now? How about Vanessa? You start.
I'll start. It's definitely, not the result that most of us wanted to hear with this case. I wish that I could say at this point I was surprised, but, it still is just heartbreaking because more than anything, this is her family that has to see in her, case, in her matter, there won't be any justice in this way. I just think the whole story and just in reading about the background, the case leading up to this, who Breonna Taylor was, it really is so unfortunate because this was a woman who was, she was getting educated. I believe she was the first in her family to graduate high school. She was going forward with figuring out her life the same way that many of us are, maybe starting a job and then saying, I don't know if I want to do that job, and then finding a new path and trying to date and find someone who, is going to be a good partner for you. And maybe you run into someone who isn't. And then, I think she was living life in the same way that many of us are living life. And it's just unfortunate that in this issue, in this situation, her being murdered, and wrongfully so, I feel, just kind of being in that wrong place at the wrong time, really, and who the police were actually looking for and that sort of thing. So it really is unfortunate that her life has now been lost because of this. We do see like the protests. We're having protests as well here in Raleigh and Durham. We actually were put on a curfew, I believe, yesterday with the protests and things. So it's disheartening. I don't know, as a Black woman, it's emotional. And it just makes me want to see change and figure out what I can do. What impact can I have? What impact can we have around the country? Because I feel like so many of us have tried to speak out and we're still hitting a brick wall in a lot of ways.
Mr. Well Traveled, how are you feeling about it?
Well, I would say, like Vanessa, my reaction wasn't one of surprise, certainly. But then I think immediately I wanted to go to action, because that tends to be where my mind goes. But first, before getting to action, was what do I need to know about this specific situation? So I did listen to about 3 actually, New York Times podcast. So there's a show called The Daily, and I was able to listen to The Killing of Breonna Taylor parts 1 and 2, which came out actually a couple of weeks ago. So it was prior to the verdict. And what was particularly interesting was that there was a very deep exploration of Breonna Taylor's life, but then also the circumstances surrounding the I guess the execution of a warrant. And I think that the podcast drives you to a very particular conclusion, that we have a legal standard that actually, in this particular context, favors the police over the victim. And once I understood that part, then I listened to the episode of The Daily that came out the day after the verdict, and it's called On the Ground in Louisville. And you go through the motions of what the journalist is experiencing on the day of the verdict, and what she's seeing, and what she heard when she was at the press conference. And I realized that there is a big disconnect, right, between what we think should be happening and what is actually going to happen. And I think that I was left with this sense of, okay, what do we do now? How do we prevent this from happening to someone else? There is a legal framework that I think we must dismantle, and must think about an approach to dismantling that will help to favor the victim the next time this happens, because history has shown us that this is not something that will stop happening. And I don't think anyone wants to be in the position of the Taylor family. I don't think anyone wants to see a family member not get justice when there is clearly wrong done. But there is that disconnect, and we've got to figure out how not to have that.
Yeah, I completely agree and echo what both of you have to share, that it wasn't necessarily a surprise because of the laws that are always in place. And those are really the things that need to be addressed and changed, because I think we probably can all agree that, unfortunately, we feel like this is probably going to happen again, and that something needs to change and be implemented so it doesn't happen in the future, right? And that people are held accountable, because for the only accountability to be held is for the bullets that missed is really not right, right? And I can't imagine anyone hear that statement and think anything with them. Well, we're all thinking, right? That's right. Unfair. That's unjust. That's not right. And we need to do something. It's going to take time. It's really going to take time to put leadership in place and to change the laws, change the rules around the country, so that police officers are held accountable for their actions, because their power has gone unchecked, and that is not what America is supposed to be built on, right? These are the powers that we as taxpayers pay to protect us as a society, and they're not, and that needs to change. It's hard for me to even understand that people won't agree with that statement.
Right. And I think kind of touching on what Mr. Well Traveled mentioned with the daily podcast, I also listened to both of those episodes, and they were really informative for me in understanding more about the particulars of the case leading up to the situation. One thing that stands out for me, because of course I was thinking, what is some action that we can see that can be taken? You have people that are saying defund the police and different comments like these. One thing that was interesting that podcast highlighted is when they were talking about the increase of crime in that region, they implemented a large number of like police setups, police raids all around the region to try to combat what was going on. And that stood out to me because it's like, you have a high number of crime or poverty or whatever it is that's going on, and your way to address it is, let's throw more police at it. And knowing what police do and you know, the distrust. And so I think I was looking up like social disorganization theory. My background is social work. So I kind of think from a lot of those biopsychosocial issues that may come up. And I would love to see more communities look at the issue of crime, at more of the root cause. What is causing, you know, these individuals in these regions to sell drugs? A lot of times they're trying to make money because they're in poverty. They don't have opportunities. I would love to see more of a collaboration of putting in social programs, community programs that can assist, be it job development, creating job skills, creating apprenticeships. So much that can be done in these communities, and the money, if we want to take the money from one area and put it into another, that I would have loved to see be the first reaction before you say, let's just add more cops on these streets that are just going to harass and accost people, which is going to cause more unrest and can cause situations to happen. I would love to see just addressing the change from that point. Even if you do want to still have, you know, law enforcement, pairing them with community leaders, with social workers, with mental health workers out on the street when they are going and dealing with these things. It's so much that I think can be step one for these communities before it's let's just increase our police presence everywhere. That was something that really stood out to me because these communities are hurting in a lot of those ways, and adding more police, I don't think is going to solve that.
Yeah, I agree. So I want to go back. You brought up the social disorganization theory. And for everyone listening, what that is it's a theory. And Mr. Well Traveled and I always love these different theories and systems. So I wanted to bring it up and explain it. But the article that you shared with us, it describes it as it seeks to explain community differences in crime rates, right? And identify the different characteristics in communities with high crime rates, and then how the society kind of explains these characteristics to contribute to crime, right? And a lot of it always comes back to racism, right? Like how specific communities got put, whether it was in the inner city or wherever you are, and how groups are discriminated against and kind of bundled together and put in a position, whether it's desperation or need or lack of resources that elevate those levels of crime because they're put in a much more difficult situation.
Right.
Mr. Well Traveled, I wanted to ask you about some of your thoughts about this theory, because you're always the person that I go to when it's like, oh, we got a different system or theory or concept or idea. What do you think about it?
Well, I didn't know, actually, interestingly enough, that your background was social work, Vanessa, because actually my undergrad is in sociology. So
nice.
I'm always, and that's what when I was a student at North Carolina A&T, my major was social work, actually. So
cool.
I originally had dreams of being a social worker.
As we all do.
As we all do. Spectacular
Changing the world.
Changing the world, all of that. And well, other things happen. Actually, you know, the long and short of it is, it was faster to get a degree in sociology than it was social work when I transferred schools, because social work licensure is different in Texas versus North Carolina. And so I would have had to take more courses, and I was ready to graduate. So
Yeah.
I studied sociology, but I really appreciated the background and grounding that I got in social work. And yeah, I mean, I think what I react to probably most strongly is understanding how um, our society has developed, in particular. The neighborhoods, right, that we talk about as being these high crime areas, and that there is no evidence that more police actually prevents crime or addresses root cause of crime. And I've been very strong in my belief that we have to address root cause, and how we address root cause actually is about addressing the inequality and inequities that exist within our broader society. Because we can't say that we have to address crime without addressing opportunity and access to jobs and to healthcare and to food and all of the things that people need at a very basic human level. So I think part of the challenge is that we continue to have conversations about the police, what the police are doing wrong, what the police need to do. But that is something for me, I feel is a distraction, because we actually have the Kerner Commission report from the 1960s that actually outlines very clearly the steps that we need to take and the things that we should be thinking about in terms of addressing not police, but actually the communities that are affected by police brutality and negative police interactions. And they're all focused on addressing the social determinants of people's lives. The challenge, though, I think right now is that we continue to have the same conversation that we've actually been having from a policy perspective for over 100 years now. There have been police, there have been presidential commissions that have existed since the early 1900s to address this very issue, because this issue is not a new one. It's been going on for hundreds of years. And we might be entering a conversation at a point at which social media exists, so we can view it in a very different way, but the root cause of the problem is the same. And I think for me, I really want to have that conversation. I am very clear that when we think about things that we want to see done differently, we also have to think about how do we get there. So we may have a vision for a particular standard or a particular way of interacting with our public safety officials, but the path to getting to that needs to be clearly outlined, and then we have to take the action of voting in the right people who can help us take the steps towards getting there, and continue to repeat that process and be, I think, oddly enough, I think we have to be more invested and engaged in educating ourselves about policy and about law, because part of what I see as the emotional connection to the verdict is that many of us, and I'll include myself in this, actually didn't know how the law would look at this situation differently than how we actually look at this situation. Those of us who are not in law enforcement, those of us who are not in government or politicians or lawyers. And because that disconnect exists, that requires us to do some additional work so that we can make sure that we're driving our politicians and our support and our dollars, because we're also folks who are making donations to organizations that are going to help us get where we want to go, to make sure that we're driving towards the right things. So I think for me, when I hear a theory that's introduced that helps us to really frame the issue properly, I think that that's very helpful to us, and we should probably make sure that we are bringing that back up the next time we have to have a conversation about police brutality, because we will be back on this topic again very soon, maybe even next episode, because unfortunately police brutality is the standard.
Yeah.
Oh man, that statement that you ended there just hurts, right? Like that's the standard is just a terrible, unfortunate reality. And I wanted to bring up, because Vanessa, you shared another article with us that I thought was really interesting that I hadn't known. And it was from Vice, and it talked about different programs that cities have implemented or experimented with around the country. And one of the examples I didn't even know about, I went to school in Eugene, Oregon, and I had no clue about this program called CAHOOTS, which I thought was a little weird of a name, but it stands for the Crisis Assistance Helping Out on the Streets. And in 2018, they said that CAHOOTS executed 24,000 responses in their neighborhoods, which were about 20% of the local 911 calls. And they weren't sending out police officers. Instead, they were sending out mental health experts to deal with these crises. And it actually, saved a ton of money, but also lowered people showing up in the ER and really had a much bigger, more helpful impact. I'm curious just more about what you thought about the article and maybe some of the points that you wanted to share regarding it.
Yeah, I really enjoyed that article because it kind of solidified the thinking that I was having of just the reactions that, law enforcement have been having with people on the streets, and seeing this happen so many times. And I'm like, this could have ended so much differently. Why are we escalating to this point? I really enjoyed reading the fact that there are a lot of cities who already are implementing ways of bridging the gap. So while they may not, come from the idea of completely getting rid of law enforcement, they're saying what ways can we supplement with law enforcement or even replace the response from law enforcement to have someone else. I think one of the biggest things that would be helpful to law enforcement would be for them to become mental health first aid certified. So that's an actual certification that I've held. I actually need to get it renewed. It's very similar to when you get certified as a first aid. It's very similar to that, but it's a mental health response certification. So if you come upon a person and they're having a mental health crisis, what do you need to do in that situation to help de-escalate the situation, to assist them in the same way that if you see someone choking in a restaurant, you would administer the first aid response. It's really interesting to me that law enforcement has no requirement of that, has no requirement of, certain levels of societal awareness that I think, the things that I kind of learned in school, and because in a lot of cases, I may have gone into people's homes and having to deal with them and learn how to de-escalate the situation. I feel like even more so, law enforcement needs to know these types of tools and tactics. So I really like the article because if they aren't going to initially start there and get certified, bring someone with you then that's certified, so that maybe if you pull up on a person out on the street, you may say they're being destructive initially, but that person may be able to say, that person is having a manic episode, or something else may be going on. Or especially on cases where, I think I was reading an article about a situation where the person was telling the police, this is my brother and they have mental illness and this is what's going on. And there still was an altercation. So it's kind of like, I want to see more thought in that. I want to see less just reaction immediate and more breaking down, what can we do? We see it with other races, the time taken to really get down to what's going on. I really want to see that with more Black people and brown people, of law enforcement, mental health workers, a lot of these individuals, first kind of giving them the benefit of the doubt. What is going on in this situation? How can we de-escalate it before we're ending up with a dead person on our hands?
Yeah, a quote that was really great in the article was a quote from Barry Friedman, who runs the New York University's policing project. And he says that we have one size fits all policing, right? And that's really one of the big roots of the problem. And he says that police aren't trained to do a lot of things that they end up doing. right? 911 calls have such a wide array of circumstances and things that are happening. And so when we train police officers to use force and law, then we're going to get results that resemble force and law. And there's so many cases of 911 calls that don't require that kind of action. And so we need to, whether it's provide police or train police or have other experts to address all those different issues. That sounds to me like it's going to be one of the primary changes, and sounds like one of the easiest changes, because we have examples around the country, like the one in Eugene that's been going on for 30 years, right? So there are examples of how to do it, and they even prove that it saves money, which is an even better thing, right? Because then you can take those dollars and put them in other places to benefit the community. Mr. Wiltrout, we haven't heard from you in a second. You got any thoughts from there?
The only thing that I would add to that, I mean, I think you both articulated a great points, and a position I am totally in agreement with. The only thing I would add to that is that I think we have to reimagine what safety is and means in our society. I've talked to so many friends and family about this issue. So this is going to be anecdotal, right? Like I'm not bringing the evidence here. I'm speaking from conversations, and I find that immediately when the conversation of the police comes up, it's about particularly in a reaction to what protesters have demanded, whether it's abolishing the police or defunding the police. I've heard these reactions of, well, we need the police. What are we going to do if we make these changes to policing? And I always kind of wait until the person has said what they've had to say, and I say, well, here's the thing. Police are not the causes of the crime. Police are also not in the position to prevent crime. In fact, something has to happen. So whatever thing you think in your mind, whether it's a murder or rape or whatever, a theft, that has to happen first before the police can intervene. So if we know that these crimes can exist. And also there's sometimes police involved in things that are not criminal at all. In fact, that's what Vanessa was really speaking to about mental health issues. In many of the cases, there is no crime that has occurred, actually. And to also be clear, police are not responsible for determining whether or not your punishment should be given to you that moment, right? That their job is to investigate. Their job is to determine whether you need to be taken to jail because you are suspected of having done something. And then a judge, a court system, a jury, that's where you're actually convicted of a crime, and then your punishment is given. So I think when we are talking about police, what is it that they are supposed to do? What is their job? And if their job involves things that we as a society think that maybe that should be somebody else's job, we need to have programs that allow us to shift that burden elsewhere. And I think in order to understand that, it's also about determining, okay, well, then what is safety? What does safety look like? And I think for me, the first thing that comes to my mind is something that has nothing to do with police, nothing to do with criminal activity. It's about, for me, food. That's the first thing that comes to my mind. The next thing, housing. The next thing, clean water. Next thing, clean air. Because the fact of the matter is, when you have your basic needs that are met, there are some things that you won't have to worry about, and they will not lead you into a situation in which you would somehow come into contact with law enforcement. And I see that as a part of safety. Building a safe community is ensuring that everyone in your community has their basic needs met first. I don't know how we start to have a broader conversation about the definition of safety, but that's what I would like to add, I think, to our discussion and to any discussion. I think, I am a voter like anyone else. So those are the things that are in my mind and that I bring to the table. But I know that that's not how everyone sees it. And so I think if anyone ever asks me, that's That's what I'm going to offer.
Great. Thank you very much. Okay, we got to transition because, I'm looking at the time. I love how we get into these deep conversations. It's kind of actually like how this show all started was Mr. Ballot Traveler and I. Sometimes we start topics and we're like, oh, we came to talk about this, and then 3 hours later, we hadn't even talked about it yet. That's maybe what added to the procrastination of us starting the show in general, is because we got deep into other great conversations. So we want to talk in this section of the show about 3 specific people, 3 very important people that we've lost in the last month. And so let's start with Justice Ruth Bader Ginsberg, who passed away at the age of 87. She was the legal architect of the fight for women's rights in the 1970s. She served on the Supreme Court for 27 years, and she was pretty much the most prominent member of the Supreme Court, especially recently, because she also became like a pop culture phenomenon here with the notorious RBG concept with the crown, which was just amazing. It's really cool to see someone in that position become like transcend their power and their position within the government to like really become this public figure that we all know about. I don't really know, or I didn't know any other Supreme Court justice before her, right? And for her to become that well known, and I think it's although very unfortunate in the circumstances and that she passed away, she leaves an incredible legacy, right? And I think it's important for us to acknowledge her legacy and speak about her. And the show is really about talking about history and the things that we're living through right now. So we want to make sure we honored her. So Vanessa, how about we start with you? How about you share some words about what you think about the late, great RBG?
Yeah, so, of course, getting the call, I'm like every month or, the weeks come, and if someone's calling me and it's late at night, I'm like, it's probably, like, what are they about to tell me? So, I get the call and they're like, Ruth Bader Ginsburg passed away. And it's crazy because the first thing that I was thinking, which is really sad, is, oh my God, her seat's open. Who's going to fill it? What's going to happen? And then it was like, hold on, let's pause. We just lost someone. We just lost a life. And so I had to tell myself, let's back up and let's be honoring and reverent of that. But, RBG was a powerhouse. And I really love what she represents because she wasn't a powerhouse, I think, in the way people normally define them. She wasn't a, gregarious personality. She wasn't a radical, so to speak. She was very much true to herself. She may have come across as reserved to a lot of people, but she was very unrelenting in her convictions. And I think that's what makes her a powerhouse. And I think that's what has helped her get the things accomplished that she's gotten accomplished. She's gotten so much done for women's rights, for gender equality rights. And I just really, I think we'll definitely feel her absence and what she has done, and having someone on the Supreme Court, especially at this time, who represented what she represented. But I really enjoyed hearing more about her life. I rewatched her documentary, and I'm just like, this is an amazing woman who really fought so many odds from the beginning and just was consistent. And I think that's something difficult to find, or even something difficult for me to fathom in wanting to, implement social action. Someone who is consistent and has that brick by brick mentality, which I think she really embodied. So she will be missed in what she's done for our country and for policy.
Mr. Will Travel, what do you think?
Yeah, so I think my initial reaction was not one of surprise, much like I guess some of the other reactions this week, and I think it was because I knew that she was battling cancer, so I understood that. And I think what I was surprised about was how quickly the conversation went from she has passed away to what's going to happen with her seat. because she hasn't even been buried yet.
Right.
And I think that part has been more surprising to me as I have seen that even yesterday there was an announcement about a what's the word? I was going to say candidate. I don't think that's the right word though.
I guess
Yeah,
a nomination.
Nominee. Yeah, sorry. I was like, why is the word escaping me? A nominee for her seat. I mean, we're talking a week and a day after her passing, and I don't know. Something strikes me about that as cruel. The idea that we are not given a moment to honor her life and legacy, I think is. Yeah, I don't know that that's the right standard for our society. I don't know that I feel comfortable with that being the way that we do things. That being said, that's what has happened, and I've taken the approach that I wanted to learn more about her life because, maybe I'm a little bit of different in the sense of Conner, in that I knew about Thurgood Marshall and grew up knowing about Thurgood Marshall, and he, outside of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, probably is the only other justice that I have heard a lot about in a pop culture fashion. I mean, there's a movie that Chadwick Boseman did about his life, right? So you can receive him in the same way you would a celebrity, and yet he was a Supreme Court justice. And so I knew of Ruth Bader Ginsburg as a celebrity in a sense, because so much of there was so much imagery around her. And like Vanessa, I watched the RBG documentary, and they talk about that was something that happened much later in her life. She wasn't always this pop culture icon. She was in her 60s and then 70s and then moving into 80s, and people began to really just take an interest in who she was and what she represented. And while I can appreciate that, there was a comment in one of the podcasts that I listened to about her life this week, and there was someone who was reacting to her death, and she said, I really wondered, what am I going to do now? What are we going to do now? And what's gonna happen to us because she's gone? And then the person said, well, I really had to think about that for a second, that we create superheroes out of people. And I think that that's a good point to make, that we do tend to create superheroes out of individuals. And when I looked at her life on film, right, in the documentary, there were some incredible sacrifices that she made. She had a very supportive husband, but she didn't have, for the time that she lived in, right, which is partly our time, but her marriage started in the 1950s, and during that time, it was not the norm to have men be the homemaker, essentially. And she had her husband leave his job so that she could have the career and move from New York to DC. And I think about that because that's a sacrifice, right? To determine how your marriage is going to work. And it was wonderful that her husband supported her through that. But there are also other sacrifices that they mentioned throughout the film. Like, she didn't sleep a lot. That was something that came up a lot, that she tried to have a balanced life, but she was often up until 4 o'clock in the morning. And when Vanessa, you spoke about consistency, that also was very clear, that she understood what her purpose was and what she wanted to accomplish in her career. And she stuck with that from the very beginning. And I think, it's hard in the world that we live in today to understand that methodical and multi-decade approach to social action and making change. And in fact, I think there was a moment in the film where someone described it as a very conservative approach to change. But and I think that today we live in a world where things are so on demand for us. We can have whatever we want with just a click of a couple buttons on our phone, that sometimes it seems as if change should happen immediately. And I think that was not her approach. And she understood that that was not how it was going to work, but she also didn't give up, even when there were setbacks. including during the latter part of her career on the Supreme Court, where she was considered to be the most liberal justice, and there were more conservative justices on the bench. And what made her famous was her dissent. And I think about that as also a way to will change, even when you may think you are outnumbered or overpowered or overruled, you still have a way of using your voice to affect change. And I think there was no better example of that than the Lilly Ledbetter Act, and how the Supreme Court made a decision that Ruth Bader Ginsburg did not agree with. So she wrote a dissent, which then led to congressional action, and then Obama signed the Lilly Ledbetter Act into law. And we also heard from Lilly Ledbetter. There's a lot of L's in.
It's a tongue twister.
That's a little much. A little much. So we heard from her in the film as well, along with other women who were plaintiffs in cases that either went to the Supreme Court while Justice Ginsburg was on the court, or who were impacted by decisions along the way, whether she was as a federal judge or when she was actually herself an attorney for the ACLU. So it was, I think for me as a strategist, I took a lot from that, just the determination and the thinking, and really a life that is dedicated to change.
Yeah, that documentary was super good. Anyone who hasn't watched it, I do know it's available for free on Hulu, and you can rent it on all the other major platforms. And she really had an impact on all of our lives, right? You might not see it directly, but the big thing that she always fought for was equal protection under the 14th Amendment covers discrimination-based offsets, right? And so that fight really to defend, let's just say, half of the country, right, with all women, was super important and led to so many different impacts and changes and opportunities to be better and to at least be moving towards a more equal world. And when I was watching the documentary with my wife, and she was very emotional about it, and my wife makes more money than me, she's more successful than me, and you know, she was really emotional because she was like, wow, this woman, you know, along with a lot of other people, will also say that, but the things that she fought for and stood up for against what a lot of society was saying has provided her the opportunity to be in a position of influence and to work on her own, right, and pursue a career. And her life might look so much different if Ruth and many other people didn't stand up for those rights. And it's just absolutely, I'm so happy that the modern generation is getting all this information and that she is kind of becoming this icon forever, right? I feel like she is getting eternalized in this iconic stature because it's so important for people that have this kind of impact on our society to be remembered forever.
And I think to know, one quick note, what exactly she has done, especially if, you know, a woman is out there and she's very much an independent woman, because that was something that was new for me to learn, how much of a hand she had in these different policies, like the fact that, you know, with me talking about homes and eventually moving towards home ownership, I wouldn't have an opportunity to do that if it wasn't for her. I wouldn't have an opportunity to open my own bank account or a lot of these different things. If I have children, I wouldn't be able to do that and work. She has done so much for a lot of women. And I don't think a lot of us were aware that she had her hand in that way. And especially kind of probably like you're saying with your wife, the women that we are able to become today, we have to give her credit for laying that groundwork and hearing the no's first, you know, that we don't have to hear in those ways. We still have a long way to go, but I was very intrigued to learn how much she opened doors for us in that way.
So go ahead.
Oh no, I was just going to say, just as there was something that, as you said that, it reminded me of my reaction during the film, that how different the world was when she was, working for the ACLU and going to the Supreme Court to try to, make these laws change. Like, there were things that just seemed so minor and insignificant. I'm like, it was such a, for me, it was such a disconnect. I was like, why is there an issue with, I think one of the cases was, I think, a man who wanted to receive,
Widow's benefits.
widow's benefits,
Yeah.
and I'm just like, why would they deny that? Like, I just couldn't even like wrap my head around the fact that there was a world where you could legally discriminate against men and women, because that was the point that she was making, that these laws hurt everyone, not just women. And it was much like, I talked about it in episode 1 about my conversation about segregation with my grandmother, that it's hard to wrap my mind around the fact that someone could tell me I couldn't use a gas station restroom when I'm on a cross country trip. Like, I'm just like, how could someone do that? But that was perfectly the norm, and not just the norm, it was enshrined in the law. So the person who's discriminated against you is protected and you're not. So I think that was also my reaction to thinking about how different the world looks, and how my own way of thinking and expectations are different, because the law has changed, and so long ago, while still within her lifetime, but before my lifetime, that as we move forward, I guess I'm a bit more hopeful that we can continue to build upon that, because obviously there's still more work to do. We know that in a lot of instances there's still discrimination, gender discrimination. So there's still additional work to do. But I think if I got anything from Justice Ginsburg, I want to make sure I'm correct. That was something that was mentioned, I think, in the film, where it's like, no, we call her Justice Ginsburg. We don't call her Ruth. So Justice Ginsburg, if I got anything, it's that she spent time laying the legal foundation for us to be able to continue building upon. And so I think that for me is the big takeaway. Like, the world that she was working to dismantle, we don't want to go backwards, and we don't want to rebuild it. We want to keep moving forward down that path.
Yeah, no, when we consider who is next going to be sitting in that chair, we all hope that they will continue to create progress and move forward and not go back. That is the big concern that is on the table as of right now. So someone else we want to shout out, and I'm really glad that we got to bring this up, because I know after the last episode we didn't, but that was John Lewis, right? And John Lewis also has an extremely big impact on our society, and his involvement with the government and the changes that happened from famous March walking in Selma. But he also, if you don't know who he is, was a U.S. representative for the Georgia's 5th congressional district for more than 30 decades. Or I'm sorry, 33 decades, 30 years. And let's talk a little bit in just remembrance of him and the impact that he had on our society as well, to give him the appropriate acknowledgement as well. Vanessa, I see you nodding, so let's start with you.
Yeah, like the thing that's coming in my head is just hearing in his voice, good trouble, getting into good trouble. And I think when you look at with Justice Ginsburg being kind of like that steady flowing force, like John Lewis was very much like, I'm going to be out here, I'm going to get into good trouble, I'm going to get arrested, I'm going to, be almost beaten to death. But he really knew the severity of us having certain civil rights being implemented. I just think about when he was in that march, and I believe he was 17. He may have been younger, but I believe he was in that range in the initial march on Selma, and just coming across the bridge and being met with law enforcement and knowing what's waiting for you. It's just, I really just imagine, like, is that something I could ever face? Is that something that I could ever do? I really think the individuals of this time, they just had such a tenacity and such a hope that, things could change. And they were really unrelenting in following that and seeing through. So that's something that I love about him, and just how he never gave up. And then once he was able to get into certain doors, always fighting for us, even up until, almost the end of his life. Like, I love the picture of seeing him, and, he's more frail. You can see that, he may be having some things going on, but going out to like the Black Lives Matter Plaza and seeing him just taking that in, it's like, you are an activist up until the end. And that is something that is so inspiring to me, because I think something that these individuals represent is what I call like lifelong community fighters. And kind of how we mentioned, they're in these roles, in these positions for 30 plus years. And, a lot of, with our generation, it's like, we're ready to be done with the job after 5 years. And it's just kind of like, how do you, but it's in their heart. It's what's pushing them, propelling them to want to see change, even if it's change that they don't get to enjoy in their lifetime. And that's something that I love about John Lewis, that on the one hand, I'm sad about that he passed, seeing things, the more things change, the more they stay the same. But I am glad that he was able to see and realize that he had a mark on our country, on the world, and that, he got into good trouble for us, and we were able to reap some of those benefits. So I really, really appreciate his life and his legacy.
So I should jump in, can I? Like, I don't know. I feel like we're still getting used to this format where we've now added, like, before it was just two people, so it's just back and forth. Then there's a third person. Like, okay, so who goes
like,
next?
Who wants to go next?
Whose job is it to speak next? No, I mean, I'm so excited that we got to bring up John Lewis, because, I watched Good Trouble. I think it was last weekend, and it had been on my list for a while, but I just hadn't gotten around to it, and I watched it, and there were so many things I didn't know about his life, and I love the term lifelong community fighters. Like, that is we need that on a t-shirt, because I feel like that is a constant reminder of who, I mean, when we talk about, like, so far I've brought up, Thurgood Marshall, we've talked about Ruth Bader Ginsburg, now we're talking about John Lewis. I mean, when we talk about those people, the reason why we talk about them is because they dedicated their lives, literally their entire lives, to social action. And we do live in a world today where social action can be fleeting, or it can seem like, well, I did this one thing, I donated some money over here, or I voted over here and I'm done, or I went to the protest yesterday and I'm done. That's not the lesson that I take from any of these individuals. And John Lewis, I think, in a very powerful way, I mean, the violence that he faced. And I kept thinking to myself, I don't think I could have done what he did. I just don't. I don't think that that's who I would ever be. And the amount of strength that it takes to put yourself in harm's way and continue to believe that you're doing the right thing, and no matter what comes your way, you're still doing the right thing. I mean, he was in the hospital at one point, having gotten hit in the head during a protest, and he came right out and started protesting again. And I don't know. I think I would have reflected on that a little bit differently, to be quite honest. But he had that type of personality, and he truly believed in the cause. And so I think for me, to see a film, and I guess the other thing I take away from this is I'm glad that I'm able to live during the time when John Lewis was still with us, right? So I got to see him on TV. I was familiar with him as a congressperson, and I also got to hear his words. And it's different than, when I read something like The Narrative Life of Frederick Douglass, where I can understand the person conceptually. I can read I can read history books or biographies, or I can watch a documentary, but I don't really get to see the emotions or who the person was beyond the social action that we talk about. We got this. See, John Lewis loved chickens, and that was a big part of who he was. Like really, like even in his office, he had little chicken figurines, and that went all the way back to his childhood. And I don't know that about some of the other historical figures who were alive, pre-social media, pre-TV, pre-radio, right? So I appreciate that I was able to get all of that, not just the sacrifice that he made and how deeply invested he was in the cause, but also that he was a whole person, and all of us deserve the opportunity to be a whole person, but also we should be fighting for the change that we want to see in the world. And so that to me, I think I'm very grateful for that.
Yeah, it's unbelievable that in the same month we've lost these two like powerhouse, incredible, iconic figures within huge movement that helped continue huge movements within society. And I know with Justice Ginsburg, she was inspired by the civil rights movement and the work that that John Lewis was involved with in the beginning. And it's very interesting how, not necessarily they're both like directly connected, but how their actions have both moved forward and progressed, and the longevity and the commitment and the consistency with both of the work that they've done is just absolutely incredible. So sad that we lost both those people. But Mr. World Travel, you point out, I feel also very lucky to, at least for a part of our lives, to live in the time that they were also alive, right? And be part of now remembering them and kind of starting to immortalize their stories, because the future generations will just be able to read and watch movies and know them from that kind of context, but not actually see some of the direct impacts that they were making in our society, even here in 2020. And so there was one more person that we wanted to highlight here in the show that not a lot of people are going to know about. So we're hoping that maybe a few of you learned. And this was from an article. How we learned about this person was from the New York Times. And his name was James Jackson. And he passed away on September 1st. And what he did is in 1976, he founded the Program for Research on Black Americans at the University of Michigan. And he also created the study in 1980 called the National Survey of Black Americans. And this was really important because it had always been about like, how do Black Americans compare to white Americans, right? And the article talks about how like white Americans are the gold standard, right? And so what is wrong with Black Americans was always how the data was collected in reference. And so he wanted to show, and he pretty much spent his whole life creating data sets on understanding the African-American experience, right? And showing that that was not only very different from white counterparts, but also within the own community, right? How there are different experiences and different changes. And a quote here was, social science research is oftentimes problem focused, right? The questions tend to start with perspectives by asking what's wrong with Black people, right? And why that connected with so much with me, because Mr. World Travel, you and I always talk about always identifying the problem first, right? We don't usually spend enough time really finding that root cause of the problem. And I thought that like encompassed that story perfectly, right? Like we were identifying the problem in the wrong way to begin with, and that created a cascading effect of issues with how we were learning about the broader state of America. And so I'll pass the mic to you guys, but I just think that James Jackson was someone that we needed to recognize, because his impact is not obviously as well known as someone like John Lewis, but he should be recognized because the work that he's done is incredibly powerful and long lasting. How about we start, Mr. World Travel, with you? What do you have to say?
Yeah, no, I mean you said everything that I would have wanted to say, so that was perfect. Yeah, I think recognizing that his work actually will live on because of the institute at University of Michigan, right?
Correct.
And yeah, so I think that's important to keep in mind, because although he was the head of the institute for quite some time, there is a new head, and so the work continues, the survey continues. And I think the bigger thing, because to be honest, you sent me the article and I had never heard of him, and I don't think that I even saw anything on social media about his passing. And so the idea that, this obituary had come across your screen and you made sure that you sent it to me, I appreciate. And I think the idea of addressing and researching and understanding the complexities of the African American experience, I think, is very important. I know there are many people who recognize and say that the experience is not one size fits all, but oftentimes in conversations, it sounds that way, that it's the Black experience or the African American experience. And the reality is that it's a lot more varied than that. And just like it is within any group of people, where we are not all having the same experience at any given point in time. So I appreciate that approach from a social science perspective, because um, still to this day, we continue to have this "what's wrong with Black people" approach to research that I find to be problematic, because I think if you spend enough time thinking about the issue, you get to the same conclusion all of the time. So it's like, and we keep doing the same studies and over and over and over again. And it's like, all right, listen, when are we going to address the root cause here? Like, let's stop trying to fix Black people, because Black people aren't the problem here. So what excited me was that this gives me an opportunity. Like, oftentimes I like to be able to have evidence to put my hand on and say, and this is not just my opinion. And so I think keeping his work alive and making sure we're bringing it into a popular discussion, because we're not, this is a podcast and we're not politicians, we're not in government officials, we're not folks who are doing anything different than anyone else is doing. We're living our lives and we're working and we're voting, of course. But we also are taking the time to inform ourselves. And so this is something, the work of James Jackson is something that we can add to our sphere of influence. And hopefully that helps us to make better decisions. And what I also like about what we're doing with this podcast is we are documenting some certain things that are happening right now in the world. And I hope that in the future, someone comes along and listens to this episode. Maybe it's 10 years from now, 50 years from now, 100 years from now. And because his name was mentioned and his work was mentioned, that they'll know to go back and pull his work. I think that's something that will be a good reason why we've taken the time today to really acknowledge him. And so I hope it does have an impact long beyond our lives.
I guess I'll jump in, and I really appreciate you, Mr. Well Travel, probably the same way that you appreciate Conner passing it on, because I also, and I was sitting there thinking, because going through 2-degree programs for social work, I'm like, I have never heard of this man. And that's baffling to me, with all of the millions of research papers I've done, that I kind of wish I was still in school now, because I'm like, I would have loved to, use him as a resource for different things, especially if I was talking about, the Black community. But I don't recall hearing of him. Maybe I did, but again, a lot of focus even in the education arena is going to be on studies that may have been conducted, around the gold standard, as they say, white Americans. So I really enjoyed learning more about his life and what he's done. And, while he may not be a household name, he really has an impact and done a lot of things that can make an impact for the way we view our lives. And I do love the fact that he didn't look at Black Americans as like this lump of people, as so many people in our society and community, you know, that's how they view, you know, Black people. I can think about being in a lot of situations as like the only Black person in the room. And if there's something that comes up that's related to anything Black, everyone's kind of like looking at me like, so what do you think about that? And it's like, I'm not the spokesperson, you know, for all of the Black community. I'm a very different person. You know, what one person's Black experience and experience in the world may be very different than my experience. So I like the fact that he, you know, was like, I need to put a spotlight on the fact that not only are, you know, Black individuals, we have our own life, we have our own style, we have our own things going on, but we're also different from each other in the same way that other communities are. And I think there was one part in that article that was referencing something he said, and I probably won't get it exactly right, but I'll kind of paraphrase it, where he was saying that a lot of times they looked at research and data for Black people and was saying, you know, what is the problem with them? And he was kind of saying, make it more solution focused and say, despite all that Black people have gone through, how are they able to succeed?
Yeah.
And so when he made that comment, I was like, I love that, because similar to what you're saying, it's not looking at just the problems and not addressing the reactions, but what are the root causes of things, and what are ways that we are succeeding in the community that can be highlighted and that is noteworthy, given all that has been built into the society and into the laws and everything against, you know, the Black community. The fact that you see so many able to be successful and rising, there should be more study and more focus on that than just looking at the problems. It's the same that any other community would want. If you want to focus on the benefits, the successes, that's the same thing that, you know, the Black community wants to have focus on as well, especially at the African-American community, because of what we have given and done to really be a part of the fabric of this country. So.
Well, I think that leads us probably to the conclusion of the show. I feel like we covered so much. I'm looking at the clock now and be like, we always want the show to be like an hour, and then we just keep going. But rest in peace to Justice Ginsburg, John Lewis, and James Jackson. We want to publicly thank all three of them for their contributions to our society. Try to somewhat immortalize them in our own way for the impact that they had on our lives, and how all three of them dedicated their lives to bettering their communities, right? And the action that they took to make their communities better. And that's kind of what we're all about here on Community as a Verb, is highlighting all of these amazing people, whether past or present or maybe future, that are benefiting their community. And so that leads us to Vanessa, our first guest here on Community as a Verb. Thank you so much for being on the show, for kind of taking this journey with us and being the first guest. And yeah, we really appreciate you. How about we give you one last shot here on the show? Tell us one more time who you are, what you're working on, how people can connect with you, and any important messages you want us to share. This is your podium, your stage to say whatever you'd like.
Sure. Well, thank you. First off, you know, thank you, Conner and Mr. Well Traveled, for having me. I really appreciate being the first guest. It's been a great conversation, and you guys are also doing great work for the community at large. So I really, really appreciate everything that you're doing. I think as a final note that I would just love to leave people with is, you know, while we look at the individuals that we've talked about, you know, their lives seem so their impact seems so huge, and it might, you know, discourage some people from getting started in wanting to have social action or a community impact. And one thing, the same way I'm trying to encourage myself, I just want to encourage others, you know, just start somewhere. Like, if you know that you're not, you know, in policy making or any of those things, if there's something that you want to do in your community that you think would impact it, feel free to start doing that. If you want to start a podcast, feel free to let your voice be heard. There's so many ways we can all, you know, make one little impact and do our part that can change our communities and hopefully our world as we go forward, and to be consistent. I think that's something I'm taking away from this, and that I want to encourage people to do as well. Just get started and keep it going. But the best way to find me, so I'm not a content creator or any of these things. I'm just, you know, a regular girl trying to get my voice out there. But I have the podcast with my sister, so that is the Undefined Good Girls Podcast. You can find that anywhere you listen to podcasts. We have an Instagram that we're trying to start and get up and running, but that is at Undefined Good Girls Podcast on Instagram. And you can follow my personal Instagram, and that's Nessa at Nessa_Janay. So Janay. You can follow me there, and I'm trying to do better on social media as a whole and just being more present. So hopefully I'll do that. But I would love to, follow you guys and see what you have going on and get some dialogue going. So that's what's going on with me.
Well, I think that's awesome, and I'm following you, of course. I want to thank you as well for coming on the show, and I really have enjoyed the discussion with you. It's so interesting to meet someone in this format that I feel like we've been following each other for probably some years now.
Right.
I've never actually met you, and so having a conversation with you like this is awesome. It feels really like normal, actually, and organic, and so I really like that. And I have a great appreciation for the work that you and your sister are doing with your podcast. And thank you for talking a little bit more about that, because it really has given me a better understanding of sort of what your impact is and what you're able to or what you're trying to accomplish with it. So many people have podcasts, right?
Yeah.
And some are really interesting and some are okay, but I think you really got something with this one, and I hope that we can see it grow and hear about you on one of these popular shows where they bring in commentators. And they bring in you, because I like your perspective and I think the world needs more of it.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah, for sure. Also, okay, so I want to ask Conner what Conner's working on, because normally Conner asks this question. So I want to flip it real quick, and I want to say, Conner, what are you working on? Because I saw something online this week that I really want you to talk about. What are you working on? What have you got going, Conner?
Thank you for bringing it up, by the way. One of the initiatives that I took on this month was we have an event called Dining Out for Life that happened this past week, and Dining Out for Life here in Seattle, that happens all over in lots of different cities, but here in Seattle, it promotes a company locally called Lifelong, and Lifelong is a organization dedicated to fighting against problems with AIDS and HIV. And so every year what they do is they partner with these restaurants for Dining Out for Life, and the restaurants take a portion of the proceeds of that night and they donate them to Lifelong's program, which is called the Chicken Soup Brigade, which also helps people in tough situations have food, right, and resources. And over the last 6 months, they've had to double their capacity, because we all know why there's a growing need for those kind of services. But that's a tough situation because restaurants are also in a very difficult situation right now. And so they had to change their system this year. And some restaurants still participated, but they were more asking for the community, instead of having the restaurants drive a primary set of the donations, they were saying, hey, please go support these businesses. Some of them are making donations on their own, but along with eating out, please make your own donation. And I have a friend, he runs a company called Viaduct, and he creates clothing that is kind of like culturally resembles our city, right? And so whether that's like sports or different things that are going on, monuments, icons of the city, and he creates merchandise for it. And so we collaborated on a shirt that was originally designed for pandemic relief. It says socially distanced since 1887 or 1889, I'm sorry. And so what I did is I put the shirt on my website and he put it on his, and we donated all of the profits to Dining Out for Life for any of the sales. And so yeah, it was a cool way to generate a couple extra $100 or couple $100 for the cause by selling these fun t-shirts that we made and donating the money to Dining Out for Life. It was just a fun thing that it was like, what are the things that we both have, right? He's like, I have this design skills, these shirts that we know how to design and publish and promote, and I have a platform to get the message out. So why not take all of those tools that we have and put it together for a good cause. So I think this is something that we are going to continue. So I'm sure I'll bring it up on the show, but we want to do, whether it's quarterly or monthly, we're going to do a different design representing some cause or organization and the city that we live in. And there'll always be a donation aspect to the sale of every shirt to a different nonprofit or community here within our city. And so if you're interested in the shirt, you can find it at findmeinseattle.com/shop. And I know we don't have Apple Pay on there right now. I apologize, Mr. Well Traveled. I will work on it here this week to figure out why we can't. But PayPal, credit cards, all those other forms are taken there. And keep an eye out for more clothing to come. Thank you for bringing that up. I appreciate you giving me the platform to talk about it.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think that's a really cool way to take social action, and that is what we are all about here. That's why we started this podcast, and I think it's important to show the different ways a person can take action. And I think with that, as always, me, I'm all about the voting rights and making sure we are fighting back against voter suppression. So work continues with the app. We're hoping to have it, launched on the Apple App Store at the beginning of October. That's of course going to depend on a few factors, but we're still trying to get it out there before the election. And so if you want to follow that journey, please feel free to go to @NextUpCity on Instagram. That's where I document that whole process, and I've got some cool content that I've also created that you can feel free to share with your followers, because voter suppression is real. And while we cannot change the drivers of voter suppression right now ahead of the election, we can educate ourselves and we can arm ourselves to fight back.
Excellent. And you got a big road trip coming this week to head to Texas. I think I'm really excited for you to check in here on the show about what's going to happen, because you're going to be in Texas for the election. And that is going to be very, very excited to hear the things that you have to share and how this app launch goes, because it's, I think, a critical and important piece of technology that you're launching to help fight against voter suppression. So thank you very much, as always, Mr. Well Traveled, and Vanessa, thank you for being our first guest. We appreciate everyone for listening to the show, and we will see you in another 2 weeks for episode 4. Bye.
Thanks.